It is the 13th day of Preptober for the 2018 NaNoWriMo, and this is my video on world building. Now, world building doesn't have to be super complicated. It really depends on how much you want to put into it. But world building can be really big, like really big and intimidating. In fact, depending on the type of story that you're telling, the word world in world building might be a bit of an understatement. But not to fear, I have many tips on how to overcome the world building blues and things you might want to consider in building your world, or worlds, or universes, or alternate dimensions, or whatever tickles your fancy. And this video is only going to be the first video in several videos I'm making on this topic. This video is also going to be what I consider the most rudimentary way to do world building. For me, it's the easiest, and also I found that it helps ensure that you don't do a bunch of extra world building work for no reason, and it doesn't actually end up being important in your story. So with this, there is a disclaimer. I primarily do a bit of my world building while I'm outlining, and then a lot of world building after I'm done outlining. Now, I don't world build at all before I start outlining, which might sound a little bit weird, but I will explain why either later in this video and a little bit later in future videos as well. So like I said, I do most of my world building after I've done a very thorough outline, which sounds a little bit weird because some things in the outlining process are so interwoven into the world that you'd think that you wouldn't be able to avoid doing world building in the outline, which is why I say I do a little bit of world building while I'm outlining, and then I go back and I flesh out a lot of the rest of the stuff that might have gotten missed. Now, you probably know a lot of stuff about your world if you've already done the outline and you're just doing some flesh out world building after your outline. You probably already know stuff like where most of your scenes are located, what kind of technology they do or do not have access to, maybe a little bit about the politics if that enters into your story at all. You probably know a little bit about cultural elements and such that are in your story. And if you are doing this the way that I do it, where you outline first and then you world build on top of it to more flesh it out and figure out how things are going to work and how everything's going to come together properly, then you probably know a lot of basic things about your world already. But if you do outline first, then you're probably glancing over a lot of the things that you will need to flesh out more thoroughly in your story if everything's going to be detailed and actually be a colorful and intricate world that you've built and sewn together into your story. So I'm going to show you how I do this and give you an example of how I do my world building after I do my outline with the outline of my very first chapter for the current nano project that I'm working on. Okay, so bear with me. I'm going to be reading this, and this is rather rough because I threw this together earlier today, but it's just to give you an idea of how I kind of flesh out my world building after my outlining phase. So I'm going to read the outline that I have of the first chapter, the summary for the chapter, and then I'm going to read the things that I ended up fleshing out world building wise that go with that chapter. So the first chapter is Zyla is operating her underwater drilling unit, otherwise known as her UDU. So there's an example of where I had a little bit of world building inside my outlining. Looking for a good drilling location for planting pillars for the underwater current turbines that generate electricity for the colony above. She ends up seeing something on the scanners that gets her attention. It's a signal that registers a pattern similar to that of the Z-wave radiation that still emits from some of the meteors that are scattered across the globe, leaving massive dead zones, and which everyone avoids getting too close to since they are still deadly. There's more world building that's already in the outline itself. Now she goes a little closer because she knows that there shouldn't be any meteors here. It would be outside of their recorded fall pattern. She starts experiencing turbulence, and she receives a message from her landside navigator to come back in and get out of that area. She doesn't want to come back in before she looks into what's actually messing with her scanners. She's told to come back topside at once and go no further. She begrudgingly agrees and turns around. So that's my basic summary for the first chapter. And in this, these are some of the things that I came up with. Now, this is not an exhaustive list of things that I could do world building on for this particular chapter, but it's just to kind of give you a rough idea. And I'm very kind of free form when it comes to these, because I don't think that every chapter is going to have the same needs as far as world building. I think you need to be intuitive about what questions you're asking and what stuff is getting filled out for each chapter. So it's not cookie cutter at all. So the first thing I asked myself is, what is the location? Now, in this case, the location is her UDU, which is her underwater drilling unit, under the ocean. And I have specifically here where I put UDU, which looks like a submarine, but has 4 spider-like legs that brace it in place for the drill that is placed on the bottom of the craft to drill a hole in the ocean's floor. It's used when scouting underwater locations for mounting the underwater current turbines. The amphibians in the... Oh, I forgot about this. So I kind of went a little freeform into this because I got off the UDU, but I went the amphibians, which by the way are my people, some of my people in my story. This is going to be way out of context for you, by the way. But they're amphibian people. They have a 3rd lung, which allows them to breathe salt water. They are far more resilient or resistant to cold and pressure. So they're kind of ideal for doing these underwater missions. So I specifically say that here, where I say amphibians are the main ones chosen to operate the UDUs, since they are significantly more tolerant of the cold and pressure than normal humans, otherwise known as landers. So there's another bit of world building I have written in there, because I have different names for the different types of humans that I have. And then also, since the amphibians can breathe underwater with the assistance of their 3rd lung, they are less likely to drown if the if the sub were to take on water. The population above is dwindling, and every life counts to these people in order to avoid extinction. So they try to moderate risk as best they can. So there's also some societal stuff that I'm throwing in there, is that the reason why they choose amphibians to do this is because at this point the human race is not down to a lot of people. In fact, they're having to branch out colonies into areas that have been otherwise deserted because of horrible natural disasters and stuff, to try to find more livable habitats so that people can start reproducing more and start having the human race kind of bounce back, because it's been on a decline since several horrible natural disasters have happened in my book, in the previous books, because this is the 3rd out of 3 books in this trilogy that I'm working on. Now, I haven't written the other 3, I've just kind of basically outlined them, but this was the one that I was most excited about, so I started with this one. Anyway, the next thing that I asked myself, this is getting so ranty, I apologize. The next thing I asked myself is, what are the main things my character would see in this scene? So I put switches, control panels, the blackness of the outside landscape this deep in the ocean, little flecks of particles passing in front of her headlights in the black water, sonar screen, and navigation screens. And those were some of the things I listed. The next thing I asked myself is, what does it feel, smell, or taste like where she's at? Which are kind of things that I have a harder time remembering to put in my descriptions, so I made sure to ask that here. So I put that it's cold and cramped, and it's particularly cold in the submarine because she is so deep underwater. And they don't waste electricity on trying to keep you warm. Plus, she is amphibian, so she's a little less affected by it, but still it would be uncomfortably cold, even for her. The air has a metallic tinge because they would need to use air purification system in a submarine like this. She might have a snack that she's eating while she's working, and I could describe what that is and how that tastes. And I put literally, that might be fun. Have fun with it. Like, I told you, these are like freeform type things. And they shouldn't be cookie cutter because, I mean, you can obviously have them be cookie cutter, but it's not as fun that way. And world building can be grueling if you don't make it fun. So the next thing I asked myself is, what history led this character to this place in this chapter? Now, this is going to be super out of context for you because you don't know what I have outlined in my other books and stuff for it, but the main character is part of a colony which is attempting to reestablish themselves on the coasts of America, hundreds of years after the Yosemite supervolcano decimated most of the continent. I know I'm using decimated wrong because, anyway, we won't get into semantics. Our main character is a Phibian, and then I have it kind of clarified here, a newly evolved type of human that was established in book 1. She is a 3rd generation Phibian. That's very important to me because book 1 is where I have my 1st generation Phibians, the ones who remember being a normal human, and they had this cataclysmic event that caused like premature super fast evolution. So they actually remember being normal humans. And then in book 2, it's the 2nd generation Phibians, who are basically kind of an experiment to see whether or not they could be mixed with normal humans safely and not screw up the gene pools, and if it's okay, or if that would like create weird mutant people that have all sorts of medical problems. So anyway, that's their journey in book 2. And then this is book 3, where Phibians are a little bit more commonly accepted, but there's still some kind of backwards people who are kind of assholes about it. But anyway, that's not anything like what we have nowadays in certain things. But anyway, back in here, the world above has horribly harsh winters, and she is working with her base to establish underwater turbines to generate reliable energy source for them before winter comes in. The winters are particularly harsh because of the supervolcano, as well as the asteroids that were scattered across most of South Africa, China, Russia, and those places in book 1, which takes place at that time. But all that would throw a bunch of dust into the air, and I know that because I had to learn a little bit about volcanoes as well as asteroid strikes and the effects that would have afterwards. It would cause a global cooling trend afterwards because of all the stuff that get tossed up in the air. So in this, they are still feeling the repercussions of particularly harsh winters from that, which is another aspect of world building. You may have to research stuff to figure out how things would work so that you can incorporate that into your world building. Now, they have already had several setbacks delaying the completion of the project, and they are running out of time before the next winter hits. Now, I go into a little bit because I had mentioned earlier in the chapter the Z-wave radiation, which is in the first book, and talked about more in that. And I specifically elaborated on that for myself so that I know that aspect of my world building. So the Z-wave radiation is the Z-wave radiation is from the comets that landed on Earth in book 1, which carried with them a new kind of radiation. This caused a rapid evolution of the Homo phibiensis, or Phibians, in the previous timeline. Why is there Z-wave radiation here when it shouldn't be? That's explained in a later chapter when they find the underwater city. Now, I specifically put those notes for myself because one big problem that a lot of people seem to run into when they're doing world building and stuff, and then incorporating that world building into their actual drafts, is that they do all this world building for certain sections, and then they do these info dumps to try to get it in, but it isn't always necessary in that location. You may need that information, but you don't necessarily need it there. Now here, obviously it would make no sense for me to explain why she's seeing this Z-wave radiation showing up on her scanners, because that's a little bit of a mystery. She doesn't know that yet. We don't find that out in this chapter. Now in a later chapter we do, and it ends up being very important to the plot. So that's why I specifically put, we're going to go into that later, don't worry about it right here. But this is some basic stuff about the Z-wave radiation. And then the next thing that I asked myself is, what is the landside navigator that I mentioned? So I had mentioned that she has a landside navigator who's basically calling her up and saying, hey, get out of there. We're seeing you're having trouble. Head back to base. Now, I kind of elaborated a little bit on that, and I said that people working with the UDUs or the underwater drilling units are paired up with someone landside that can track their movements, and in the event of an emergency or equipment failure, help guide the operator home or even take control remotely of the craft so long as they still have power. So I kind of put an example, like kind of like Major Tom, NS, or in NASA. But anyway, and then the equipment is very hard to replace, and they want to be very sure to have more than one person who can bring it back home safely. If anything goes wrong or the driver does something stupid, they can be overridden. Basically, if they're doing something dangerous or something that could endanger the equipment or something, they can be overridden and brought back to base, because these are very expensive units and they have an energy crisis. The last thing they need to be doing is wasting time going out there to try to find a piece of equipment if something happens. So with that, that's pretty basic. This is a pretty rudimentary version of how I do the basic world building. What I like about doing world building this way with each chapter outline is it guarantees I don't do any unnecessary world building that isn't required for the information that's actually being told to the reader from the outline. It really cuts down on a lot of info dumping too, because it helps me zero in on, okay, what exactly bits of world building might need to actually be inferred to or fully explained in this particular chapter. Can they be explained later instead, and can it be sprinkled throughout the story? And I find that really, really helpful by doing it this way. And it also helps me not miss things that need to be covered in the world building, because I've got this little summary right here, and I can look at each sentence and in the summary and say, okay, is there anything in there that's going to need to be explained in world building? Yes, there is. We got UDUs. Let's elaborate that. Is there anything that's going to be needed in this sentence? It's like, yes, we mentioned landside navigator. What the heck is a landside navigator? And I can go into that. So specifically the things that need to be world built for that particular chapter. Now, so clearly this, like I mentioned, is very unstructured, and I will be going over some more structured world building stuff in my next videos, where I'm going to break down different elements that you may want to consider in your world building if you want to be more specific about things. With that, the next video I will be doing is actually on how to world build your specific locations and ideas on how to pull that off. Now, I will also, on October 15th, I will have a world building sheet available on my website at cswellswrites.com. That'll be available for you to download, and you can feel free to edit it, change it, not fill things in, fill in things, and then add more things of your own. Do whatever you want with it. By all means, be flexible and just have fun with it, because world building should be fun, and it shouldn't make you want to curl up in a ball in the corner, sucking your thumb and rocking because you want to have your head explode from information overload. Anyway, that's all I'm going to do for tonight. This is turning into a long video. Hopefully this all sounded fairly coherent. And you guys have a great rest of your day.